House Bill 214, an act relating to the purchase or lease of personal protective equipment. Representative Koch.
Gentleman from McCracken.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Bourbon 72 for explanation of the bill and motion thereon.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Bourbon for explanation of bill and a motion thereon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My good friend, the gentleman from Jefferson 33, started this conversation last summer, and I think we all remember March and April and the shortages of PPE gear that we had here in Kentucky and all over the United States as COVID settled in. And so we wanted to start a very important conversation with this bill, a conversation about the security of Kentuckians, a conversation about the security of Americans for that matter. And that question is, how do we have American manufactured PPE gear that meets three requirements? One, how do we make sure it's available? Two, how do we make sure it's available? How do we make sure it's affordable? And how do we make sure that it's the quality that we need it to be? So we came up with this conversation and we started it. And one of the things that I've relied on through all this is the Berry amendments, which I'm very familiar with being in the military. Congressman Berry, congressman from the 1950s to the 1970s. And he first came up with a Buy American bill, and later through history it's been changed into the Berry amendments. But it basically said that our military clothing must be American made. And that's everything down to the go fasters that we wear for physical training. It must be American made. You don't want another country producing your gear that you have competing global interest with. So that's something I had in mind as we started this question. But this is a pretty fine line that we have to weave, because we don't want to create an artificial market. We're not interested in that. We're not interested in a company, we've had a lot of companies start up and start producing PPE gear. And we're not interested in creating a false market that somebody can go in there and they can get rich off that. That's not what we want to do. But at the same time, as COVID wraps down, there's going to be another crisis at some point in our future. I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I don't know what that's going to be. And so we wanted to start that conversation of how, as leaders right here in Kentucky, can we make a difference on this? And so that's where all this comes from. And the gentleman from Monroe is not here, but he put some fine work on the House Committee Sub 1, which, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call that now.
Clerk, please report.
House Committee Substitute 1 to House Bill 214.
Gentleman from Bourbon.
So House Committee Sub removes private businesses and medical providers. Only the public agencies will remain. Give preferences to Kentucky-made PPE and then to American-made if the Kentucky isn't available. Clarifies that this measure doesn't apply to any medical providers. Removes the civil penalties. Removes the clause exempting entities for anything that would increase costs by more than 10%, and puts an emergency clause on there. So, Mr. Speaker, if there's no questions, I move adoption of House Committee Sub 1.
Motion is for the adoption of House Committee Substitute 1. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, those in favor signify by voting aye. Those opposed, nay. House Committee Substitute 1 is adopted. Gentleman from Bourbon.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like the clerk to please report House Floor Amendment 1.
Clerk, please report.
House Floor Amendment 1 to House Bill 214.
Gentleman from Bourbon.
This floor amendment actually comes to me from the gentleman from Bullitt, and we redefined what public agency is. It means the Commonwealth of Kentucky, its departments and agencies, but does not include state-supported public universities, and we included state and university-affiliated hospitals as well to make sure that they are excluded on that. With that, Mr. Speaker, if there's no questions, I move for adoption of House Floor Amendment 1.
Motion is for the adoption of House Floor Amendment 1. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, those in favor signify by voting aye. Those opposed, nay. House Floor Amendment 1 is adopted. Gentleman from Bourbon.
Mr. Speaker, if there's any further discussion or questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, I move for passage as House Bill 214 as amended by House Committee Sub 1 and House Floor Amendment 1.